Hello and welcome to this lovely document where first I need to explain what are we even doing here. I'm talking about writing and editing, specifically writing in English, but that goes without saying because I'm using English, and that's one of the things where when speaking normally we want to say a lot of things like that goes without saying, which to me would be one of these red flags where if I'm editing something that I'm putting down on paper, then I would try to edit that out. So this is going to be like a collection of red flags with actual examples, which I got a lot of with this document. But I'm starting off with an introductory video to explain the purpose and premise of this thing overall. So my biggest motivation for this is that I think the largest reason why modern writing is bad is because a lack of editing of the writing itself. I don't think editing is taught, editing prose, editing dialogue. I don't think there's a good reflective process that people understand how to do. So we need to have a foundation for what are we trying to do. And as vague as this is basically an axiom that I have, is the goal of good writing is to have a coherent flow of interesting ideas. If I'm writing a fantasy story, then I'm trying to talk about interesting stuff along the lines of a theme, and I want that experience to be conveyed where at no point along the way is the person taken out of the story by me writing something that's bad or failing to edit out something that's bad. Well, what are these bad things? Stuff that it jars your suspension of disbelief, or it's an inconsistency. Those are the two big things. Something that doesn't fit within the world, and something that goes against whatever you've said before, which you can subvert both of these, which you can subvert any rule. So talking about exceptionalism is kind of stupid here because, this is the introductory thing. So exceptions exist. Let's put that in here. I do want to better document some of these ideas that go through my head while I am speaking. So a very important aspect of being able to mull over ideas and think, does that make sense or not? It's super, I was going to say it's supernatural. It's a very natural thing to have a conversation, to have a discussion about something and work through an idea by talking through an idea. That's not necessarily the most masculine thing, and it's also a very social thing. So it's something that a lot of people in my day and age don't really have a lot of experience with. Writing itself is very isolating, but one of those things that helps you to edit stuff better is going over the ideas in a verbal fashion, which I am emulating through doing a voice recording and a video recording as well. So another topic to move forward with this is, in writing, there's no right or wrong answers, but it's like there's no stupid questions, but some questions are absolutely dumber than others, especially if you've established, like, we have this grounds of discussion where we're acting in good faith. Like, there's no right or wrong answers. Like, you can't say you can't have a fantasy book that's medieval fantasy and have a laser gun in it. I'm sure there's something somewhere, somehow, that you can have a laser gun and make it convincing and interesting in a medieval fantasy. So again, exceptionalisms really slow down the conversation, but because it's subjective, it's hard to give solid yes, no answers to this should be taken out. Well, what should it be replaced with? I'd have to think about it. And that's, again, why we need to have this goal. In every scene, with every paragraph that you write, there must be something interesting or meaningful for you to be writing. Otherwise, then it's not going to amount to anything, and it takes away from the book. If you have a whole bunch of these little specks of dust of meaning, well, that's the letters that are on the page that come together to make the mountain that is this wonderful journey called writing a book. So there's no right or wrong answers, but the wrongest answer is being boring or confusing. If the other person can't understand what you're saying, because the grammar can be done in a very weird way sometimes, where stuff is, let's say, grammatically correct, but it doesn't necessarily make sense, or the word choice is just off in a way that makes you think of something that you shouldn't be thinking of because of word associations that kind of conflict with thematic stuff. And when I give examples like that off the top of my head, I don't have a sentence example, back pocket to show this or that, which is why I have the whole bunch of examples that we'll be getting into in the actual episodes down the line. And again, that's why I'm doing this whole thing of doing the side-by-side edits. Well, let's actually move to that point. Why do I have this document, and what is it? Well, I have a draft of a book that I'm writing, and when I edit something out where it catches my eye, where I go, oh, this is something that I have to fix, there's a whole bunch of rules that I have in my head because I've been editing for years and years. I've been an English teacher for a long time, and well, it depends on your perspective of long, but then I'm going into exceptionalisms, and that's messing things up, so I'm bringing things back on track by moving forward. I've done a lot of editing, so I have a lot of rules in my head for, oh yeah, I noticed this, so I just change it. It's kind of like if you're a car mechanic, you learn to read the diagnostics of how does the machine actually look when you pop open the hood. It's hard to explain the smaller details, and when you're working, you really get into a flow of, oh yeah, I see this is loose, so I have to tighten it with this tool. And that's hard to explain to someone, and it also is rather tedious to teach someone the finer details, which you do have to open up the hood and look at the guts, and I can see why people don't have like a lot of resources to draw upon for seeing what's happening under the hood when editing something that's prose, when editing something that's a novel, because it's a difficult process for a lot of people to explain. And also a lot of people who engage in the writing process are not technical but are creative and generally aren't the best at explaining things, let's be honest. And that plays into itself as to why does modern writing suck? Well, a lot of people suck at explaining things, and ultimately, when you're writing a book, you're explaining an experience. And the better you get at explaining things, in a convincing way, the better of a book you'll have at the end of it. If you get better at prose, then your ability to describe things and to write technically will increase as well. As I'm recording this, I have the intention of cutting up interesting pieces and making short videos, like YouTube shorts. TikTok might not be a thing. There's some oddities going on right now with that platform. But having short examples that I'd be able to reference in the future, but also it's for an educational purpose of like, this is a good example of making this mistake. And where this comes from really comes back to language learning, which is something I've invested a lot of time and effort into. And I taught English as a foreign language. And the really core aspect of what gives you mastery over a language is seeing interesting sentences and seeing enough interesting sentences that help you grasp how to make those interesting sentences yourself. So I already explained a little bit about my background in English teaching, and I want to give a little bit of a different perspective. If you are learning a foreign language, at the end of the day, you're trying to get a collection of experiences so that you get a grasp on how the language is used to create a coherent flow of ideas. So I'm trying to take the same approach to how would you learn a foreign language to how do you take your understanding of a language that I assume you're functional in, at least, even if English is your second language. If you're listening to this, you have a level of fluency over English in order to be able to comprehend what I am saying. But how do you go from that, from using the language, to having mastery over the language in such a way that you can confidently and consistently make an interesting flow of ideas that are coherent and draw the reader in and make people want to keep turning that page? A lot of people will give the advice. Reading books is very much like watching a sports game to learn tactics, to learn team maneuvers, to learn different things that you can do in a game. You might see someone pull some kind of tactic in a game of football that you hadn't seen before, you hadn't thought of before. It's good to have inspiration and points of reference from someone who has lots of experience. from studying coaches and teams that are very skilled. Oh my gosh, I'm making a sports ball reference while talking about a nerdy subject like writing. I bring up the concept of watching a sports game to contrast that from actually being a player on the field. When it comes to writing, you're not actually on the field kicking the ball around or throwing the ball around until you are writing. Oh my gosh, that's the silver bullet that no writer wants to hear. To gain experience with writing, you must write. Thus the name writer. A big stupid piece of advice is, dude, just write more, bro. But if you don't know how to write, then it's like, just go to the gym, bro. Okay, but how do you exercise effectively? So that's something that I want to bring up specifically with talking about editing, because I don't think you need to have skill to draft ideas. The whole purpose of a draft is to put some ideas onto page and you'll make it make sense later. You shouldn't struggle to get it perfect the first time around. You need to edit. You need to edit, and you're just doing the process incorrectly if you're trying to get things correct the first time around. Because later on, in order to make things make sense, it doesn't matter how closely you plan things, stuff will emerge that works really well, that changes the structure of the story, where you need to go back and edit to make sure that things fit together so that everything is smooth. So you should not at all be worried about, how do I write a perfect first draft that I don't have to edit? No, the purpose of doing a draft is getting the ideas on the page, which again, that's actually putting the cart before the horse, because before you draft, you do a planning phase, which that's where the real, in my opinion, that's the most creative aspect. When you're shooting ideas about, wouldn't it be cool if we had a scene that was like this and that? And the process of writing an outline is very much what if, speculating what if, but doing that in a structured way, which is the difference between just messing around and having structure to it. The reference I was making with that figure of speech is from Mythbusters. I believe it's Adam Savage. The only difference between science and messing around is writing down the results. Something to that effect, where a lot of people enjoy casually talking about, I have this idea for a book, or I have that idea for a book, or maybe people don't enjoy divulging it because it's so difficult to find people that are open and accepting to bounce ideas off of, which is another thing for why people today struggle with making interesting writing, is that they don't have people to bounce these ideas off of, so they're not so great at the idea creation and refining process. All of this was to say that there's a whole lot of creativity in the outlining process, from my opinion, for how I structure things. There's a whole lot of creativity in planning. There's a whole lot of technical skill in editing. When it's actually writing the draft, it's like a translation skill, because I've done some translation work before, except you're translating shorthand, or here's a sticky note of ideas into a rough outline of paragraphs, where even when I am doing a draft, sometimes I'll run into a bit of a roadblock where I'm like, I don't know how to transition from this scene where they're inside a ballroom and then they have to be outside in the garden for the next scene. I don't know how to do this of like, they walk down the steps, so it doesn't make sense for them to be walking down steps. What rooms are going to be between the ballroom and the garden? Or do I do a hard cut where it's like screen fades to black, start a new chapter? What's the length of the chapter up to this point? There's a lot of little considerations like that, where when you're doing a draft, you shouldn't be worried about that at all. I would make like a footnote for, scene transition to garden. And maybe I will do that if I do recordings of me doing drafts. I've seen a couple of things like that on YouTube, where people will narrate as they are typing out a draft, but that's not what I'm majorly going to be focused on with the example editing series that's going to be going on after this. Of course, this is just the intro and a long discussion about what's my purpose for this and how are we going about things. It is absolutely necessary to have long-form content, like long-form discussions, in order to convey certain ideas that don't fit into 256 characters or less. This is about developing the skill to create that, what was it again? A coherent flow of interesting ideas over hundreds of pages. It's hard to do that, and editing is what stitches stuff together. I'm not going to talk so much about like where do ideas come from or what makes a good idea. This is about taking something that you have written down where we already assume that you had some intention, and that intention motivated you to create a scene on the page. And yes, sometimes we'll have to revisit scenes and go, does this even belong in the book? And sometimes delete it out or find gaps of, well, if we ask this question, then we might have to make another scene. And that would invite or sometimes even necessitate the creation of new scenes within the editing process, where if I do make a new scene while editing, then I will have that area highlight. I'll use a background color like this, and I'll have, I'll usually put 2 asterisks by something so that it's easy to Control F and find the 2 asterisks. As you can see, it's highlight there. That's just document management technical stuff that's like in the back of my head for how do I manage this. So if I were adding something new, then it would just look like that for however much I'm doing, however much I'm adding to the book. So if I am scrolling through and I see that highlight, then I don't have to like remember where it is or what the content is. And I have a consistent ending tag here, like the 2 asterisks that I have, where I would pick a symbol that at no point I would have in the description itself. But that's just my own deal there. You could have like percentage sign or at sign or whatever, something that's not going to be in the general prose that you have. So it just makes searching easier and faster. So anyway, I wanted to briefly touch on I'm not going to be discussing where do ideas come from, or are you a planner writer or a pantser writer where you got to sequence things out versus just discovering things. Yeah, that's the discovery writer versus a plotter. Just for now, suffice it to say that there's a lot of skill that focuses on the creative side in the planning phase. There's just this weird translation deal that it's just about getting words on the page and just chugging through it with drafting. It's really hard for me to nail down like how is it a skill. Yeah, but then things get real technical with editing, because that's where for me the rubber really meets the road. And I have all the ideas that are out here. I've got it somewhat fresh in my head because I went through the effort of writing all these things in the draft, and I know that this will happen later on, so I need to set up the stakes prior. That's actually a huge thing. It's a very core thing. What makes stuff interesting and rewarding is an implication that something might happen. Here's how the rules of magic work in this world, where I'm trying to think of something stupid off the top of my head as a silly thing. If you catch a frog and immobilize it with this spell, like you turn the frog into stone, but then you're able to jump 20 feet high if you catch this frog and cast this spell on it. So you absorb frog jumping power by temporarily turning it into a stone statuette, and then to revive the frog, you release it from the spell, and it's just a normal frog, and it thinks like no time has passed. But if you use the spell's power too much, like if I'm jumping all over the place with this crazy super jump, then the statue might be destroyed, or someone could destroy that statuette of the frog, and then I don't have that power anymore. So I'm setting up rules that draw in interest with a silly thing with statuette magic system, and that lets people have an expectation that, oh, there's a risk that's involved with this. If they're getting this power, but then they're relying on it, there's a way to subvert that. There's a way to get around that. If you can find the statue and destroy it, or if you can find the statue and release whatever is captured in it, then you you take that wizard's power away from them and give it back to whatever was captured. That's just an off the cuff example of what's a build up and payoff, and then how do you also make rules of your world, and why is it important to follow rules of your world? It's to garner interest, to make things interesting, to build up stakes, to feel something from the book. It's really hard to create strong emotions and create tension and create conflict and create resolution if you don't have rules for how the game is played. Instead of the casual conversation version of it, what is the prose version of it? That's what comes out in editing. So yeah, all that is to say that the way that we edit is not the way that we speak. When we're drafting, we're just getting the words out on the page in the way that we would speak, and we're not worried about having crazy purple prose to stuff or getting the right words there. Worry about that later on, because you're going to have to go over things to make sure that they make sense when read as an experience of turning one page to the next. Also, your sense of time and pacing gets messed up if you don't go back and edit properly. So a lot of the work, in my opinion, a lot of the dedicated technical work to how do I make this something good, comes in the editing phase for me. And that's the difference of, well, read a bunch of books and you get exposure to it, but you don't get exposure to the process of taking something that's there. First off, you don't get exposure to the process of creating those interesting ideas like I was talking about with the planning phase, and you don't get experience with fixing the ideas that you've conveyed in a casual, mundane way, and then taking that stuff that it's like, that's boring, or that doesn't really fit. How do I make the judgment calls on is this good or bad writing? You need experience with that to edit well. And I see why a lot of people delegate editing out to a professional editor, but the editor never has the same exact vision that the writer does, and that's something where you really need a strong relationship with the other person, that you trust them very well to fulfill your vision. So you're not actually on the field, you're not actually building up the skills, building up the creative muscles until you are creating something yourself. You're not a writer unless you write. A small caveat that should be a little bit encouraging is everyone struggles when they're inexperienced. And that's something that I feel a lot of writers who try and give advice generally fall short because of the amount of experience, the amount of hours they've poured into the skill. You start to lose track of explaining, well, how did you make that scene happen? How did you make that book happen? And that's where we have the classical lame question, where do you get your ideas from? It's like, how did you make that book interesting? And ultimately comes down to the collection of line by line, how are these words portrayed in a coherent manner where stuff is interesting. And that does come down a lot to style, but things don't make sense until you analyze, how is this sentence good? And you need a comparison of how is something mundane, something that we can relate to, what's a sentence that we can say off the top of our head, and then how do we take that and make it into something that no one would say off the top of their head, but is quite interesting, then has some style to it that counts as something literary. And the goal isn't to be like highfalutin and, oh, I'm so above these other people because I'm saying things that no one else would say. Editing is about taking things that are easy to write and writing them again into something that is very hard to write. And this is a matter of, again, my perspective is you draft quickly, and that helps with editing, not necessarily slowly, but that helps with editing well. You go slow and you put the thought into things in the editing process, not in the drafting process. Inexperience is no reason to be discouraged from your writing seeming awkward. Again, everything's awkward with drafting. This technical dive into how do we take mundane stuff and make it interesting, this will absolutely help with gaining experience. I am partly recording this as a journal of sorts to reflect on my own thought process as an author as I am writing this book. So I am justifying the choices that I'm making from changing things in the draft or changing technical details and in one sentence to another. so that I can explain those choices. I can explain what is my intention. I have a big problem with a big question in literary analysis. What did the author mean by this? There was a pretty girl eating a hamburger at a fast food restaurant. What did the author mean by this? Hi, I'm the author here. I meant that a pretty girl was eating a hamburger. So I hate some of the highfalutin. Oh, it means that it is a critique of the capitalist system that makes people corpulent and complacent in devouring disgusting things that at the same time is juxtaposed with the beauty of a traditional whatever the heck. I don't do stupid buzzword things like that except in mockery like I just did. So I'm going to over explain some details, which is necessary for understanding why the changes are made technically, and also why are changes made thematically. Why am I changing how this guy is talking? Like, I'll have some examples of changing dialogue where how I think in my daily life as opposed to how the characters think. There are differences. So there's absolutely a tendency to write in your own voice instead of the character's voice, and I know what to look for to see that, where I'm like, oh, that's me, that's not the character. I need to change this dialogue so that the character is speaking and I'm not writing as myself. That is very, very hard, and I would even wager is impossible for some people to do because they lack self-reflection. However, the key to good characterization is self-reflection. It's another thing with acting. If you've ever done acting or been part of a theater troupe, if you've been a thespian, then when you are playing a character, that character is not you. You are putting on a mask, so to speak, and sometimes quite literally in the case of theater. You're putting on a mask to portray a character, and it's important to separate who you are as a person from the character that you are showing on stage. Okay, so when I am doing this dissection of how do I edit things, this is absolutely going to ruin the content. It's going to ruin the quality of the experience of the book for its narrative impact. Because you're going to know the intentions, but this is something that I think a lot of writers veer away from, because there's no point in reading the book if you already know all this stuff, so I can't do an analysis of it, otherwise it's going to spoil things. I don't care about spoiling this, because I am under the fortunate circumstance of obscurity. Nobody cares if I spoil my own book that nobody's going to read in the first place. However, I can get some educational content out there by dissecting these details and explaining what the heck is going through my head and why. So a huge thing is when you are editing, you already know what's going to happen. You know the spoilers. You know the themes that you've established. You've had important dialogue, you've had important action, perhaps you've had important drama play out on the page, and that gives its own kind of high the first time that you have this sort of revelation of a conversation. And when that spark goes away, for a lot of people the spark does go away after it's written, so they don't want to edit it, or they don't feel inspired to write the draft in the first place. So it's not just like a game of make-believe. When you're writing a story, it's not just like a game of pretend where you go off the cuff for whatever's off the top of your head. Though in an unexamined fashion, it can seem like that, and you can write like that, but it's not going to be very good or fulfilling. You can do that, but you're going to have problems. And even people who say that they don't edit or that they just go off the top, that's not how you refine things. And even if one person can do that, most people can't. I certainly cannot. However, that's why we have editing. Anyway, a lot of people lose the spark of what motivates them to write when they already have things figured out because they've already planned it. And then it's like, oh, I've already experienced this. Now I have to go through the drudgery and the silliness. Oh, this is like work. Yes. But it can be very interesting and engaging if you're skilled at it, if you know that you're competent at it. or if other people tell you that you're competent at it. But that's another thing where writing is a very isolating experience. So you don't know if you were good or not. And it's also hard to get good feedback and good guidance on, is my editing good, or am I just making a mess of things where what I wrote as a draft makes sense enough and I'm not really adding quality? If I'm not adding quality, then what's the point at all? It's hard to get good feedback and good direction on editing. So that's another thing why I want to go into some technical principles and show the process instead of just talking about it like I am in this intro here. A lot of the ideas that I'm going to say here need to be in a long form video. So that's why I'm doing this as a video, even though some will be shorts. I will cut and have kind of like 2 publications. The stuff that's a standalone that could fit into like a minute or 2 minutes, I'll try and do that as their own details. And I'll try and give interesting names to them so that I'll be able to point to them in the future and say, oh yeah, this error is like this that I had over here. Here's what we're looking for as the problem. Here's the solution. Here's the before and after, so that I can make a regular, repeatable process for recognizing patterns and recognizing the solutions to those patterns. Ultimately, I want to be more consistent in making good edits. So there's the draft editing that I'm doing now on my own. Then there's the read-through editing that I'm going to be recording once that's done. And then there's going to be an edit after I get an editor that I trust to look over things, and then I'll make changes, and then it's going to be ready to publish. But I'm not going over the process of publishing and all of that in this series. Not so much. If there's interest in that, I might go through the details. I might document that in a similar journalistic way, in the sense of like a journal that a person is keeping, not like I work for Washington Post and no, I don't. And I'm not doing things in that kind of journalist fashion of just a person writing things down, or I guess it's more of a vlogger perspective, but just as a guy that's writing. And I want to avoid rookie mistakes, but sometimes it's hard to explain rookie mistakes without having longer form content to set up the context that makes those mistakes coherent, or makes the criticism of those mistakes coherent. Some mistakes are not done at any single point in the book, and that's really, really hard to convey. It's not because you said one thing here. It's not because one scene happened there. It's a collection of scenes. It's a collection of mistakes that makes an overall bad taste in your mouth and a bad reader experience. Final note for the initial commentary here. Most of these entries are going to be audio focused, but I will have this wonderful plain words on a background format because sometimes the sentence is very important. Also, it will help with people that are hearing impaired to understand the words that I'm saying. If captions don't pick up on stuff, I'm probably not going to have as much side commentary in the editing examples as I am over here in this introductory discussion. However, I think the visual aspect is important so that people can more easily follow what I am writing. And sometimes there are details where when something is spoken, it doesn't really make sense, but when you see it written, then there's like a comma or a semicolon that is put in a certain place, or a dash that's put in an unconventional place that lets you know, oh, that's why he's saying this weird, or that's why there's a pause in this place. And when it's on a sentence, it's like, oh, well, that makes it easier to read than if I didn't have that comma there. Because books are a visual media, in a sense, you need vision in order to read words on a page. So that aspect will be discussed as it comes up. Regardless, thank you very much for watching this introductory video, and I will have lots and lots of editing examples to come. I will see you in the next recording, and look forward to more content like this in the future. The goal of good writing is to have a coherent flow of interesting ideas.